Hi, it is noon on Wednesday Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and this is Janet Fitch. Uh, we're doing Writing Wednesday, where I answer your questions about writing craft, the writing life, um, whatever it is that you're curious about. If you're interested, if you have a problem, believe me, many people will have the same problem. Um, I am, if you have questions for me today, put them in the chat and I'm happy to answer them and we'll have a talk. And if you have questions in between Writing Wednesdays, you can reach me at on my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and I can create a Writing Wednesday around your question. So I had a question. Hi, Meredith. I have a question from Jen. Um, and she had this question last week, and I thought I could do a Writing Wednesday around it. Jen asks, have you ever heard about using plays to study dialogue? I'm from up north, Canada, and would love some suggestions as to some plays you would suggest or enjoyed for studying this. Hi, Laura. I do have thoughts about this. And the first thing is to think about what fiction, the tools that fiction has that plays do not have, that playwriting does not have. We, in playwriting, you have to deliver everything to the audience through the spoken word. Um, Whereas in fiction, you have a multitude of tools that the playwright doesn't have. Hi, Bozena. That the playwright doesn't have. We can know what a character is thinking directly. We can spy on their mind. Um, Whereas in a play, people have to say what they're thinking, or we have no, or just make some, do some physical uh, movements and gestures and expressions and stuff. But we can never know directly what is going on in their mind. Also, dialogue in a play is just the spoken word. It's just the blah, blah, blah. Um, Whereas dialogue, good dialogue in fiction, uses all the tools of fiction writing. Um, it uses landscape. It uses internal dialogue. Internal thought. There, like playwriting, there are pauses, but the actor usually supplies them. It's usually not necessarily going to be on the page. A lot of the dialogue is scenes are um, worked out with the director. A pause, a certain kind of look, a certain kind of walking away. It's not necessarily in the play, in on the page. Um, I do, sometimes somebody walks downstage and that's in the directions. Um, but the there are so many more tools in fiction writing. And in fiction writing, because we can know what the character is thinking, and we can have authorial thoughts about the action, um, in a way that would probably be putting your finger on the scale in a play. Um, Learning dialogue from plays is a tricky thing because there is so much more talking. involved in a play than in fiction. In fiction, you want as little talking as possible. You want to use the other tools, and then the actual spoken word is only for the pressure that people put on each other. You never have to do exposition, the narrative part, exchange of information can be direct on the page in exposition. You do not have to do it with the spoken word. So you're going to strip down your spoken word and use the other tools of fiction writing in a dialogue scene. So it's very difficult to get out of a personal space. A character pauses, mother is, say, um, scolding a kid, and we can have the kid look out the window and see another kid riding their bike in circles outside, having a great old time. You can't do that in a play. I mean, maybe you can add filmic elements or something, but generally speaking, you cannot look out a window and see something out there. You don't hear something. There can be, cues, but there won't be metaphors. It's like somebody looks out the window and sees a camellia blooming out of season and has a thought about that camellia blooming out of season. Um, a playwright really has to tie themselves in knots to point that out, that it's, they have to make a big deal of it to talk about it. Whereas in fiction, you can do it at a glance and then it can tell you, oh, your character is blooming out of season. The beginning of, is it Light in August, I believe, in Faulkner, where um, somebody goes to, one of the Compsons goes to Aunt Hattie's house, and she's a very strange person, and it's this dusty house that her parents lived in, and her sacred father, and everything's about the father, and but the wisteria on the vine outside the window in the heat is blooming for the second time that year. And so, what this tells us, without hitting us over the head with it, is that maybe there's a chance for a second bloom for this poor woman. Um, Things like that you can do with fiction in a middle of a dialogue scene that you cannot do in a in a in a play. So the proportion of spoken word to the other tools, observation, the character observing, internal thoughts, landscape, the senses, all the senses. Um, I always think of it as a sundae. So it's the ice cream. It's not the ice cream. It's not the fudge sauce. It's not the bananas. It's not the whipped cream. It's the nuts on top. Like that's the dialogue. You keep the dialogue just for the conflict, and you use narrative to get you in and out of scenes, to deliver information that the reader needs to know, where they are, when they are, where's the light coming from, what's the scent, the sounds, etc., to create a full world while the people are talking. The world doesn't stop and people emit dialogue. The dialogue is held by all this other stuff. It's the matrix is the fiction, and the dialogue is just a small percentage of it, and it needs to stay smart and sharp, and not march loosely down the page. Whereas plays, that's all it is dialogue marching down the page, and everybody has to say something. It distorts fictional dialogue to think of it as a dramatic form, whether it's movies or television or plays, because fiction can do things that they can't do. So when you look at dialogue in plays, it tends to be very ping-pongy, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Whereas on the page, you don't have to do that. Because you can break in and have the internal world. You can go anywhere in the internal world and come back to the scene in the same place. Whereas on stage, they would just see somebody being quiet. So it isn't the same. But that said, I would say, what you can learn from reading plays is how to put pressure on another character, how the emotion of the scene, you follow the emotion and how it changes, where the turns are. Like take your play, your scene that you're reading, and look for the change of emotion. Look for how the character is putting pressure on the other character. And then notice where there's a turn. Things suddenly are serious. Things are suddenly more intimate. Things are suddenly getting bristly. Things are suddenly being revealed. So, in the margin, note to yourself, if you're studying a play for fictional purposes, the moves that the playwright's making. And how the also you can note how the characters' voices differ. How can we tell the difference between these characters? What language do they use? How long a sentence? Do they favor certain words, certain level of diction that sets them apart? Write that down. That's worth studying. Um, so it's both worth reading for and great, keep your wits about you when you're doing it, because you're not going to reproduce that on the page. That's not going to play in fiction. um, so Hope says some books are heavy on dialogue. Yeah, I know, because people have seen more movies and seen more movies, generally TV, and they thinking in terms of TV and movies as they're writing their um, fiction, and they're not necessarily using the tools of fiction writing. And when I mean, I will admit that when I look at a book that's got dialogue just marching down the page, to the talking, all the quotes just marching down the page with no description, no breaks, no internals, no landscape, I don't think that person is really writing fiction. I don't think they're really using their craft. I don't think they're really crafting their dialogue. I mean, dialogue is one thing you do get in playwriting and in screenplays, the idea of beats. So there is an exchange and then it's over. It doesn't shouldn't march down the page like that. It should think of a cat fight. Cats don't go 16 rounds with Mike Tyson. Cats go and then they break apart, and then they come in again, and then they break apart again. So you're better off teaching yourself when you think about dialogue, to think about a 5-line exchange of dialogue or a 3-line exchange of dialogue. Somebody says something, somebody responds, and then that third line tells you who won, who lost, what that was about. And then you can go for a 5-line exchange. And then you can put a pause in. So instead of answering the other person pingy pongy, um, the person who doesn't doesn't hit the ball back but grabs the ball, so a silence. Person who does that wins the dialogue. They control the dialogue. Um, if you think of dialogue as conflict, and it's just about conflict, you you're starting to say who won that bout and who lost. And the person who controls the silence controls the scene, as many an actor knows. Um, some I don't. I think that there are some writers who are just very, very good at dialogue, and it makes up for the lack of um, internal. And they don't do a lot of character work. They don't really set their stuff anywhere. They just are relying on the clever dialogue. Elmore Leonard, very little. He doesn't use a lot of the tools. He uses mostly. Um, he's very dialogue heavy because I think he sees a movie and is just telling us the movie that he sees in his mind. Um, so G.B. Walter, are there great novels which have been written based on a play or movie script? Great novels based on a play or movie script. Well, I would say many plays, not so many movies. The movie to the novelization is a super bastard form, but definitely based on plays. There are so many, Shakespeare alone, so many novels based on Shakespeare plays. A Thousand Acres by Jane Smiley, based on King Lear. Um, so there's a lot of fiction based on plays. I would say classical plays probably more fertile uh, than say let's write a novel based on Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Could be interesting. Could be interesting. But you have to bring something to the party, because Albie did fine with that. I mean, why would you? You have to have your own reasons why you would write a book based on that. But certainly classical. The Greeks. How many novels are based on the Greek plays? I mean, I just read Ivy Pachoda's Ecstasy, which was based on the Bacchae by Euripides, I think. Um, and that was fascinating. Um, I think Shakespeare has been done mined tremendously, for novels. Um, what great novels that have been based on a movie script. It usually goes the other way, that they'll take a movie script, they'll take a novel and make a movie out of it. Um, I think you can be inspired by a play or by a movie, but it wouldn't necessarily be a novelization of of the of the work. I know, there's certain movies that are really resonant for me, and I use them for inspiration. Um, scenes and so forth. Um, Dialogue, I think that it's more the wit, the cleverness of lines from plays, the haunting lines of Tennessee Williams, say, to read that dialogue and go, that's the kind of dialogue I want to write. And what does that mean? And really take that apart for yourself. What are the classic, you know, interactions in a Tennessee Williams? You know, he's one of my touchstones, so that's why I'm bringing him up. Um, what is the fantasist's lines? These monologues that always in Tennessee Williams. Um, Sometimes they're not. They end up not being monologues in your fiction. They end up being internals because we don't need to speak them to somebody. Also, characterologically, um, they people need someone to talk to. There's always that second person. My husband says it's called a Perry, Perry. It's having somebody. There's always a sidekick. There's always somebody who is the recipient, unless you're in a dream scene or speaking directly to the audience. That certainly happens in Tennessee Williams. There's occasionally, but usually they're talking to someone. Um, and O'Neill, Long Day's Journey, if somebody's like on Laudanum, I believe the mother in Long Day's Journey has monologue where she's not talking to anybody. She's just tripping out on her opiates. Um, and so that can be, but you don't need to do that in fiction. They can just think. So it changes the type of dialogue because you don't need to deliver information orally. Um, let's see. But I'll keep thinking about the novel, play to novel idea. Uh, See if I can think of others. Um, so GB likes the controlling the silence, yeah. Mm-hmm. Um, and Hope says one of my relatives wrote Arsenic and Old Lace. Love it so much. Yeah, that kind of a drawing room play is a very fun thing to do. Kind of an old-fashioned mystery setup. Um, so GB says I'm going to review Pinter and Mamet with a different lens, thanks to this. So very cool. Um, yeah, look at those plays, and instead of trying to emulate that dialogue, take a page or two or a scene and write it as fiction and see how it changes. See what you can get rid of, see what can be internal. Set it somewhere, you know. What's out the window? What's right in front of the point of view character? There's a point of view character in a play. Everybody is um, it's kind of democratic. Everybody is to themselves, playing their part, and it doesn't really skew necessarily to somebody's point of view. Although the protagonist is clear, who gets the attention and who has our sympathies. But point of view, it's hard to change point of view in a play. Whereas if you're going to do a scene, you decide who your point of view character is, and you can go into their mind. You know what they're thinking. So how much of that dialogue can you replace by internals, by landscape, by, you know, all the other tools, a scent in the air. You can't do a scent in a play without saying, ah, she smells of blue, blue, that was always my favorite. So Laura says, I wrote a script out of my book and found it went very fast, not having to describe setting, etc. Exercise showed me I had too much dialogue in my book. Very interesting. So that too is an interesting little exercise of writing a script or a scene in of your taking a scene of yours in fiction and writing it as a bit of a play. Um, Sometimes you just want to get the dialogue straightened out, um, and then put it back into the fiction to improve the individual utterance, because this is what you'll get out of reading a play, studying dialogue in plays. Um, every um, this was, just a big challenge to me when I was learning uh, to write with Kate Braverman. She challenged you, every line $1 million line. Imagine the best actors in the world have been hired to give your dialogue. And then you have to give them both, if there's two-person scene, you have to give them both something to do. Nobody wants to be the straight man. Nobody wants to say, you have Guile Good and Vivian Lee or something in a scene. Nobody wants to be the one to say, what do you mean by that? Or repeating the other person's line. You have two fabulous actors doing that scene, and everybody gets good lines, or else they're not going to want to do it. So that's something you can get out of reading plays, is to notice that all the lines are good. So Hope says, I love writing dialogue. I guess I come by it naturally. People put too much dialogue into their fiction because most of us hear our characters first, and then the other tools take longer to get to. So we have to pare back and concentrate the dialogue so that there are these little beats in there. Dialogue is easier, but it also tends to be flabby and spread out and more like the way people really talk, which is never really gets down to the issues. Um, Dialogue is about the conflict, and everything else needs to come out. So it's learning to bear down on that dialogue, not use it for meet and greet, not use it for do you want a cup of coffee, because all of that can be done in exposition. Yeah, I was thinking Elmore Leonard as somebody who writes like a screenplay. He's not, he doesn't really use the tools of fiction. Um, so it's just dialogue down the page. And I don't like reading that stuff. I like Elmore Leonard, but generally, if I look and I see just dialogue marching down the page, I tend not to read the book. I tend to put it back on the shelf. It doesn't interest me. That person is not really going to be using the tools of fiction writing. Any favorite writers who have mastered writing dialogue in literary fiction? Oh my goodness. I mean, all the greats, all the greats. So, writers right off the top of my head who use great dialogue. Um, Robert Stone, everything he's written, Robert Stone. Uh, his short story collection, Bear and His Daughter, Dog Soldiers, all of it. It's very sharp dialogue. I think that Carver is good. I think Didion is amazing. Played as Lays. She does wonderful, sharp dialogue. Hemingway's dialogue is interesting because it seems very superficial, but there's always the 800-pound elephant in the room that we're not talking about. So his dialogue is very interesting. Um, who else writes great dialogue? There's so many good, really good. He's a master of a certain kind of sentence. Bozena says Hemingway, the master of the sentence. He's a master of a certain kind of sentence, um, which is the stripped down form where a lot of it depends on the reader to fill in the gaps. Um, I think there are a lot of masters of the sentence. But now we're talking about dialogue, great dialogue in fiction. Um, Green is always good. Graham Greene. I mean, most really great writers are great in the dialogue department. Dennis Johnson. Um, oh my God, there is a writer, Denise Nicholas, who wrote a book called Freshwater Road. It's like looking at the people who do multi-character dialogue scenes where there's like 8 people and they all have their unique voice and their own contribution to the conversation. Her book, Freshwater Road, cannot recommend it enough. She started as an actress, so her sense of how to handle a dialogue scene is really, really good. Um, Romantic literary fiction. Sally Rooney's dialogue. I just read Intermezzo. It's my first Sally Rooney, and I'm just crazy about it. Crazy about it. So that's the first one I've read. So I'll start moving around in her oeuvre. Romantic literary fiction dialogue. I think it's the same thing as any literary fiction. I don't know. I'm kind of a stickler, whether it's a romantic scene or not. I think generally, rom- like romance, um, romantic fiction should be, if it's going to be literary fiction, should be as doing the same thing that all literary fiction needs to do. It needs to avoid sentimentality. It needs to be interesting in and of itself. Good lines, if and things that we've never seen before. Um, Zora Neale Hurston, Hope says I like dialect. Um, it's more good dialogue is more the pressure that people put on each other. So that's where reading plays is helpful, to see how the characters put pressure on each other and noticing the movement of emotion in the scenes and the turns, how the turns come about. Um, I mean, almost every really good book has really good dialogue. Like, that's part of it. Notice whatever you're reading, when your dialogue is good, give it a little check in the margin, so you start to notice how good that is. Characters don't say what you expect them to say. This is fiction writing 101, is every if it's the opposite of the Family Feud. If the reader can guess what the character is going to say next, don't say it. Say something else. Surprise us. You know, um, don't do the expected thing. Characters are always circling each other. It's like wrestling. They're circling each other. They want to apply pressure from an unexpected direction. So if you expect somebody to be to bully, make them give, let them sweet talk, or let them appear to agree or back down. It's to destabilize the other person, right? Um, let's see, who else writes great dialogue? I mean, everybody does. I think, somebody like Milos Kundera, I know that's really good dialogue, The Unbearable Lightness. Um, who else? I mean, every writer that I'm looking at writes good dialogue. Um, so you just make sure they're putting pressure on the other person. And Bozena says avoid sentimentality, especially if you're writing romance or writing a romantic scene. You know, avoid the huggy, you know, I've got some sensitive scenes in the book that I'm writing now that when people finally connect after having had a very hard time, you don't want them necessarily to be snappy, like a screwball comedy, but you want to avoid the cliche. You want them to still be their own person. Um, so who so who do you guys think writes good dialogue? Uh, let's see, offhand, I'm trying to think of. I teach a whole class in dialogue, a whole course in dialogue. So I'm trying to think of some of the authors that I use. Um, range of emotion, lying. It's always good. Um, I mean, just a simple scene. If you're trying to say, I have a scene that I just wrote, so it's on my mind, of somebody is losing an opportunity to do something because they said they would be somewhere else. And they're going to stand up to their obligation. Um, and then somebody says, well, how are you? How's it going? And that person says, great, it's great. And then they're like trying not to cry. The difference between what they say and what's really going on, the stress of that, is very poignant, because we can do internals. So we can say we're doing great, and then we want to shoot ourselves, but what choice did I have? So it's where's the tension? So Edgar Allan Poe wrote good dialogue, did he? It's not the first thing I think about, but there's a lot of tension in there. When you've killed somebody and you stuck them under the floor and you can hear the heartbeat going, and the cops are standing right there, and you know. So whatever happened to Bill? Well, I don't know. I didn't know him very well. Thump, thump, thump. Um, yeah, all the mental stuff going on, and crazy main character hollers out a confession. Yeah, yeah. Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Um, there's a lot of that shining people on in Anna Karenina. People saying one thing, another. He can. There are times that it feels a little histrionic, um, but generally he's got a good ear and a good sense of people. Um, good dialogue. I'm trying to think of like exemplary dialogue. Chekhov. People who have been playwrights write very good dialogue in their fiction. Um, I mean, most really good writing. Just watch for yourself and see what you can find. Dialogue in fiction which utilizes subtext. Yeah, that's really interesting. Always good to do. Yeah, I'm asking you guys to contribute because you'll think of things that I haven't thought of. Meredith Diamond Dove says Patricia Highsmith has great dialogue. Yes, and undercurrents of tension under something simple like people meeting for a drink. Absolutely. John Le Carre writes great dialogue, um, and really is good at characterizing different people through their speech. Um, nobody thinks like the other people, and nobody talks like anybody else. They all have their unique way of speaking. Um, Green, always green. Green is great for that. And Nabokov is very funny, and his characters are very the split between what they say and what they're thinking is where a lot of the comedy comes from in Nabokov. Um, yeah, I just recommend you look at what you're reading and ask yourself, is this great dialogue or is this ordinary? Is this something that the greatest actors in the world would kill each other for a chance to say those lines? Or would they, turn down the part? It's like, yeah, I don't want to say, what do you mean by that? You know, nobody, you can't get anybody to play that straight man. Um, so that's a good rule of thumb. All right. Well, so I would say be careful at basing your dialogue uh, on on dramatic dialogue, plays or movies or so on. And then there's a really interesting little trend of using screenplay dialogue in fiction, where it's set off, it's formatted the way screenplay is, like um, Interior Chinatown, where they use the screenplay. The guy's an actor, so he thinks in terms of what if this was, I was in a movie, and so this is what my character, me, would think. And that's very well done. Um, so anybody kind of disassociated that dissociates themselves might have that kind of dialogue. I know my husband, when I first met him, I don't know if he still does this, but because he's written so much for TV and film, that he actually, when you talk to him, he saw your dialogue um, above your head. I don't know if he still does that because he's been writing fiction and so on, but he was doing that. I mean, he did that regularly. So I guess that's when you write a lot in that style. You start like, I guess you've been typing it up so intensely, for hours and hours and days and weeks and years that he actually would see, yeah, like a cartoon character. He would see what you were saying written out above your head. Which would be an interesting character. Um, I think texts are an interesting kind of dialogue that would be very different from dialogue in plays where it's meant to be spoken. You know, texts are meant only to be read. So there's compression to them. There's also utility to them. Uh, you know, nobody's going to have a monologue about, you know, uh, the the sound of the carousel that sets off this whole memory. So it's the opposite of that kind of dialogue. Um, Hope says, I've saw some book talks on TikTok. I've never seen a book talk. I should do that. I feel like I've really lost that. Um, I saw some book talk. Laura Hope says, I saw some book talks on TikTok where the reviewers say they skip description and go to the dialogue. Isn't that interesting? They read books like ones by Colleen Hoover. Yeah, you know, I hate to say bad writers, but you know, bad writing is just doesn't use the tools. It doesn't really create a world, which is what fiction can do. It's somebody who's spent way too much time, and readers who have spent way too much time watching movies and watching television, and then reproducing what they've seen and heard. So it tends to be like really over digested, pre chewed stuff. It's somebody who hasn't been putting in the work that you put in. I see that kind of dialogue on the page, and I think, I mean, even when I was learning, I would see that kind of dialogue on the page my eyes were opened about fictional dialogue, and I realized, oh, you know, I'm working harder than this person is. I'm a student, and I'm already working harder at my fiction than these writers are. So I tend to like, you know, where they skip descriptions. People like that should read screen. They should read plays. They're the perfect people to read plays. But they're missing something. They're really missing something. I mean, think about books that you can skip the description. If you can skip the description, if you can skip the exposition, I mean, you're missing, if you don't miss 90% of what you're reading by doing that, that person is not really writing fiction, because that should be so integral. They that they're you're missing so much. You can't cut to the chase. That's You might as well read Cliff Notes. Um, yeah, I've never seen it. Now I don't want to see a book talk if they skip description and just go. My daughter's like that. She loves to read plays because of the description, the slowness of description. But she reads fiction too. Meredith says, I listen to a lot of audiobooks, but if the first 5 to 10 minutes is mostly just two-person conversations, I can't listen to the rest. Yeah, me too. Um, and that's showing you that these people are emulating television. You know, they're not really exploring the craft of fiction. They're storytelling, maybe, but they're not really writing. um, you know, your dialogue should be a good blend of the spoken word and description and internals, you know. And if you notice blocks, like big blocks of bleh, and then blocks of description, you know, that's the thing that people will skip. You know, put it in the blender so that there's description, and then there's a piece of dialogue, and then there's description, and then there's a little bit more, and then there's description within the interaction, within the exchange. Um, then the world continues as people emit dialogue. It doesn't just disappear. Uh, don't let that scare you from book talk. Hope says they're not all like that. That's good to know. Dialogue. Who writes the best dialogue? Whose dialogue just is a real standout? God, there's so many good writers, so much good dialogue. There's a woman, Melanie Ray Fawn, wrote First Body. That's amazing dialogue. You know, I did George Saunders, great dialogue. Um, Sometimes it's simple and naturalistic, and sometimes it is really witty, but you're looking for a certain amount of compression in the dialogue. When you see it marching down the page, that's usually a very bad sign. Uh, I hope in the future, GB says, you will review how to write metaphors and simile in literary fiction. Well, maybe next week. All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time here, and I wish you good writing. And yeah, take a look at a play, a scene from a play, and then notice the turns. That's really helpful. The different beats, emotional beats, because you do in a dialogue scene want to have that as well. And then try to write a scene from a play into fiction and notice how it changes. All right. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Wish you good writing.